Evelyn Maddox stared through the reinforced glass of the mortuary prep room, her lungs burning as she watched her husband smile at the police officers arriving to take her away. Her knuckles were split, her father's brass crucifix lay bent on the floor, and the digital encryption key she'd pulled from a funeral urn was still warm in her pocket. She had just spent the last hour scrubbing another woman's expensive perfume off her skin, only to realize the legal injunction pinned to her door didn't just name her as a thief. It declared her clinically insane. The sirens wailed closer, reflecting off the steel embalming tables where Evelyn had spent her life hiding secrets for the dead. Now, she was the one being buried alive. As the officers hammered on the basement door, shouting for her to surrender, Evelyn looked at the heavy mahogany casket waiting on the lift. She didn't reach for a weapon or a phone. She reached for the lid. She had exactly 3 minutes to disappear before the world decided she no longer existed, and only one way out that the living would never think to check. The needle pierced the stiffened flesh with a wet snick, the thread pulling taut as Evelyn's fingers worked the suture through the miner's jaw. The basement mortuary smelled of formaldehyde and damp concrete, the overhead bulb casting a sickly yellow glow over the steel table. Her gloves, slick with embalming fluid, clung to her skin like a second layer. She exhaled through her nose, the sound sharp in the silence, and reached for the audit spreadsheet without breaking rhythm, numbers blurred on the page. Red, always red, while her other hand steadied the dead man's chin. This was the third body this week from the Blackwood collapse. A man whose face had been a map of coal dust scars and broken promises. Even in death, his jaw refused to stay shut, as if he still had a grievance to air with the company that had hollowed out his lungs. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the spreadsheet again. The funeral home was hemorrhaging cash. Every gallon of fluid, every yard of satin lining, every ounce of cosmetic wax felt like a drop of her own blood being siphoned away. She tried to reconcile the mounting utility bills with the meager deposits, but the math refused to cooperate. It was a failing geometry of grief. She felt the pressure of the room closing in, the weight of the mountain above Coalfield pressing down on the cinder block walls until the very air felt structural. The phone rang. Evelyn's thumb slipped, the needle pricking her palm. She hissed, sucking the bead of blood between her teeth as she wiped her hand on her apron. The ringing persisted, shrill and insistent, bouncing off the cinder block walls. She let it go to voicemail. 3 seconds later, it started again. "Maddox Funeral Home," she answered, voice flat. "Ms. Maddox, this is Marcus Thorne from First National." The bank rep's tone was polished, rehearsed. The kind of voice that belonged in a high-rise, not a basement with a corpse on the table. "We've exhausted our options. The grace period for the mortgage on the 4th Street property expired at midnight. Foreclosure proceedings begin Monday." A laugh clawed up her throat, bitter and dry. She swallowed it. The miner's jaws sagged slightly, the stitches uneven. She pressed her fingers into the cold flesh, forcing it back into place. "Monday? You promised a 90-day review of the restructuring plan. We haven't even reached the 60-day mark." The board retracted the offer based on the recent credit volatility. Thorne continued, his voice devoid of empathy. "You'll have the paperwork by end of day. I'm sorry it's come to this, Evelyn. It's simply a matter of assets and liabilities." Evelyn hung up. The silence rushed back. Thicker now, smelling of old paper and the metallic tang of the sink. Total financial ruin wasn't a concept anymore. It was a physical presence in the room, standing just behind her shoulder. She looked at her hands, the yellowed latex of the gloves stained with the fluids of a life ended, and realized she was looking at her own future. The panic didn't come as a scream. It came as a cold, clinical detachment. She turned to the industrial sink. The porcelain stained a permanent rust brown by decades of iron-heavy water. She tore the gloves off, the snap of rubber echoing like a gunshot, and thrust her hands under the spray. The water was ice cold, smelling of the deep earth and the chemicals she used to preserve it. She grabbed the abrasive scrub brush and began to scour. She scrubbed the formaldehyde from under her fingernails, the skin turning a raw, angry pink. She scrubbed the coal dust that seemed to have migrated from the miner's pores into her own. Each movement was frantic, rhythmic, a desperate attempt to wash away the scent of failure that clung to her skin like a shroud. Bankruptcy was a contagion, and she felt as though if she could just get clean enough, if she could just strip away enough layers of herself, the bank wouldn't be able to find her. The water splashed against the front of her apron, soaking through to her blazer. But she didn't stop until her knuckles bled. She looked into the drain, watching the gray-black suds swirl away, wishing she could disappear with them. The house upstairs was too quiet when she finally climbed the stairs. Usually the floorboards groaned under Silas's heavy tread, or the air carried the faint, sharp scent of his tobacco. Today, there was only the smell of dust and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Silas hadn't been home in 36 hours. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her wet hands dripping onto the linoleum. The audit lay on the table where she'd left it that morning, a testament to her isolation. She had handled the families, the embalming, the city permits, and the mounting debt, while Silas disappeared into business meetings in the city. Her anxiety shifted, curdling into a dark, sharp-edged suspicion. He wasn't just absent. He was a ghost haunting his own life. She looked at his empty chair, the way the light hit the dust motes dancing over it, and felt the sudden, terrifying certainty that he was never coming back to help her fix this. She was a woman standing on a sinking ship, and her husband had already taken the only lifeboat. A soft knock at the side door made her jump. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative thud of a debt collector or a sheriff, but a hesitant, rhythmic tapping. Evelyn moved to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled it open to find Martha Holloway standing on the porch. The elderly town clerk looked smaller than usual, her frame swallowed by a heavy wool coat despite the humidity. She was clutching a cardboard box to her chest as if it contained a live bird. "Evelyn," Martha whispered, her breath smelling of peppermints and anxiety. "I shouldn't be here. If the mayor knew I'd taken these." "Martha, what is it? Come in, please." Evelyn stepped back, pulling the older woman into the dim light of the hallway. Martha didn't sit. She set the box on the counter and peeled back the lid. Inside were reams of municipal files, deeds, tax liens, and internal bank memos from the clerk's office. "I've been watching the filings, Evelyn. I saw what Thorne was doing at the bank. But it's not just the bank." Martha leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp that chilled Evelyn to the bone. "I went through the municipal utility audits, the funeral homes accounts. They aren't just empty, Evelyn. They've been siphoned. Large transfers every Tuesday for the last 6 months. They're being drained from the inside. Someone has the routing numbers and they're bleeding you dry." Evelyn felt the floor tilt. The betrayal wasn't a market force. It was a deliberate, surgical strike. Before she could ask for names, a heavy shadow fell across the frosted glass of the front door. A man loomed there, his silhouette broad and jagged. He didn't knock. He turned the handle. When it didn't give, he kicked the base of the door with a heavy boot. "Maddox, I know you're in there." The voice was a low rumble, familiar in the way a nightmare is familiar. It was Galt, a local debt collector known for his lack of finesse. Evelyn shoved Martha toward the back stairs. "Go! Get out through the garage." "Evelyn, "The files, I've got them. Go." Evelyn reached the front hall just as Galt forced the lock. He stepped inside, smelling of stale beer and motor oil, carrying a clipboard and a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters. Behind him, a second man waited on the porch, leaning against a hand truck. "Foreclosure's active, Maddox," Galt said, his pale blue eyes scanning the room with clinical greed. "Bank authorized an immediate seizure of high-value equipment to cover the arrears. We're starting with the prep room. The stainless tables, the refrigeration units, the trocars. Move aside." "You have no right," Evelyn said, her voice cracking like dry wood. She stepped into the narrow hallway, blocking the path to the basement stairs. "The stay of execution is still valid until the papers are served personally." "I'm serving them now," Galt sneered, reaching out to shove her shoulder. The contact ignited something in Evelyn, a raw, incandescent rage that had been simmering since the first red ink hit her ledgers. As Galt moved past her toward the basement door, she didn't think. She reached for the side table where a heavy brass crucifix, a relic from her father's time, sat as a decorative piece. Her fingers curled around the cold metal. As Galt turned to sneer at her again, she swung. The base of the crucifix caught him squarely in the temple with a sickening thud. Galt let out a grunt of pure shock, his knees buckling. He didn't fall, but he staggered back against the floral wallpaper, his hand flying to his head. Blood, dark and thick, began to seep between his fingers. The man on the porch took one look at Evelyn. Hair coming loose from her bun, eyes wild, the brass Christ still gripped in her shaking hand, and stayed exactly where he was. "Get out," Evelyn hissed, her voice vibrating with a violence she didn't know she possessed. "Get off my property before I find the bone saw." Galt scrambled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In his haste to retreat, his heavy leather jacket snagged on the doorframe. A small, dark object tumbled from his pocket, landing silently on the threadbare Persian rug. He didn't notice. He was too busy stumbling down the porch steps, shouting threats about the sheriff and assault charges. Evelyn slammed the door and threw the bolt, her heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst through her ribs. She leaned her forehead against the wood, the cold brass of the crucifix still pressed against her palm. Her knuckles were bruised, the skin broken where it had impacted the metal. She looked down. There, near her feet, lay a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a bank book or a legal document. It was a private log, the kind used by men who dealt in things that didn't go through official channels. She retreated to her small office, the one room in the house that still felt like hers. She clicked on the desk lamp, the yellow light carving deep shadows into the corners of the room. Her hands were still shaking as she opened the stolen ledger. She expected to see Galt's collection routes, names of local debtors, or perhaps a list of the equipment he was supposed to seize. But as she flipped through the pages, her breath hitched. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a script she knew better than her own. It was Silas's handwriting. She began to read, and the world began to dissolve. The ledger wasn't a record of debt. It was a meticulous log of luxury purchases, a boutique apartment in the city, a membership to a private club, jewelry from a high-end designer, and every single entry was listed under the name Evelyn Maddox. Silas hadn't just stolen the money. He had spent it in her name, using her forged signature on credit applications and lease agreements. To any auditor, to any bank, to any court, it would look like Evelyn had been living a secret, decadent life while the funeral home rotted. She wasn't the victim of a failing business. She was the architect of a fraud. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Silas was gone because he didn't need to be here anymore. He had built a cage out of paper and ink, and he had locked her inside it before he walked away. She looked at the family portrait on the wall. Silas smiling, his hand on her shoulder, his grip looking more like a restraint than an embrace. He had framed her for the destruction of her own legacy. She sat in the silence, the stolen ledger open before her, realizing that the sirens she heard in the distance weren't just for Galt's head wound. They were for her. The shadows in the office seemed to deepen, the walls closing in. Evelyn stood up, her movements stiff, and began to pace the small square of carpet. She needed to think. She needed to find the crack in the wall Silas had built. But as she turned toward the window, a tiny, unnatural glint caught her eye. It was tucked behind the vintage light fixture above the door, a small glass eye that didn't belong, a hidden camera lens. She froze. The realization was a cold needle in her spine. He was watching. Even now, in her supposed sanctuary, he was seeing her discovery, her panic, her ruin. She stared into the lens, her reflection tiny and distorted in the glass. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn Maddox didn't feel like a funeral director. She felt like the body on the table, but the dead don't stay still forever. Sometimes they have to be moved. The front door creaked open an hour later. The sound was deliberate, the heavy oak groaning as if it shared her exhaustion. Evelyn didn't move from her chair. She sat in the dark, the stolen ledger tucked beneath a stack of death certificates. Silas walked in, the scent of expensive gin and a cloying floral perfume preceding him like a herald. He looked immaculate, his charcoal suit pressed, his salt and pepper hair swept back. He didn't look like a man whose business was being foreclosed. He looked like a man who had just won a bet. "Evelyn? Why are you sitting in the dark?" He reached for the light switch, his voice smooth and paternal. "The bank called, Silas," she said, her voice a low rasp. He sighed, a practiced sound of disappointment. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself a finger of whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass. "I know. I've been in meetings all day trying to mitigate the damage. But I'm afraid it's too late for the property." He turned to her, his eyes cold and calculating behind a mask of sympathy. "And there's more. Given the instability of the accounts and the legal scrutiny we're under, I've had to make a difficult decision. The annual memorial service for the miners. It's canceled. Liability issues. The insurance won't cover a public gathering on a foreclosed site." Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. The memorial service was the only thing that kept the town's respect anchored to the Maddox name. It was the day the widows and sons of the coal-darkened dead came to remember. To cancel it was to admit the Maddox legacy was truly dead. "You can't cancel it," she said, standing up. "It's the only thing left that hasn't been touched by this mess. It's for the families, Silas, not for the bank." "It's done, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. "Stop digging into the accounts. Stop talking to Martha. If you value your safety, if you want to get through this without a jail cell, you'll stay in the basement and do your job until the keys are turned over. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent assertion of dominance. He didn't see the way her hand moved toward the desk drawer where the ledger was hidden. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked the hidden camera above the door. Evelyn waited until his footsteps faded upstairs. She walked into the hallway, her heart heavy. On the wall hung a portrait of her father, the man who had taught her that death doesn't care if you're ready. The canvas was ruined. A long, jagged slash ran from her father's forehead down to his throat, the fabric weeping threads of white primer. Silas hadn't just stolen her future. He was erasing her past. She stood before the desecrated image, her fingers trembling as she touched the torn edge. The psychological warfare had begun. He wanted her broken, erratic, and silent. Downstairs, the basement lights began to flicker. It wasn't the usual erratic hum of old wiring. It was rhythmic. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. A mocking code sent from the surveillance system upstairs. Evelyn didn't flinch. She went to her desk and opened the ledger again. She ignored the flickering lights, the slashed portrait, and the smell of Silas's gin. She followed the trail of the luxury purchases, her eyes narrowing as she found a recurring address. A boutique apartment complex in Huntington, Unit 402. She had a destination. The drive to Huntington took 2 hours, the rain-slicked roads reflecting the neon of gas stations like oil on water. Evelyn felt like a ghost haunting the highway. She arrived at the glass and steel complex shortly after midnight, her old sedan looking like a rusted blemish in the circular drive filled with European SUVs. She didn't have a key, and the lobby was guarded by a desk clerk who looked like he'd been hired for his lack of curiosity. She waited until a group of laughing 20-somethings entered, slipping in behind them, her head down, her funeral blacks blending into the shadows. She reached the 4th floor, her heart hammering. Unit 402. She stood outside the door, listening. Silence. She didn't expect Silas to be here. He was back in Coalfield playing the grieving husband, but she needed to know who was. A noise in the hallway made her jump. A security guard was rounding the corner, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Evelyn didn't answer. She turned and headed for the fire exit, her heels clicking too loudly on the polished floor. She burst into the rain-slicked alleyway behind the building, the cold air lunging at her lungs. The guard was faster than he looked. He intercepted her near the dumpsters, his hand grabbing her arm with a grip that bruised. "I need to see some ID, lady. You don't belong here. Let go of me." Evelyn snarled, her voice vibrating with the same rage that had struck Galt. The guard reached for his radio. "I've got a trespasser, female, late 40s. Evelyn didn't wait for him to finish. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her heavy brass ring of mortuary keys, long, jagged pieces of steel used for industrial locks and casket seals. She swung her fist, the keys protruding between her knuckles like a makeshift knuckle duster. The metal bit into the guard's forearm as he tried to block her. He let out a sharp cry of pain, his grip loosening just enough for Evelyn to wrench herself free. She didn't look back. She sprinted through the shadows of the alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and disappeared into the Huntington night before the guard could find his breath. She didn't go far. She circled the block and parked in the shadows of a closed warehouse, her eyes fixed on the entrance of the apartment complex. An hour passed. Then 2. The rain slowed to a misty drizzle. A silver Mercedes pulled into the drive. Silas stepped out. He didn't look like the man who had threatened her in the kitchen. He looked relaxed, triumphant. He walked to the passenger side and opened the door. A woman stepped out. She was younger, blonde, dressed in a silk wrap that cost more than Evelyn's car. Evelyn recognized her instantly. It was Deborah Whitmore, the daughter of the rival funeral director from the neighboring county. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just money or a mistress. It was a merger. Silas was selling the Maddox territory to the Whitmores, and he was using Evelyn's embezzlement to clear the board. Evelyn sat in the dark of her car, her hands gripped so tight on the steering wheel that the plastic groaned. She watched them enter the building, their silhouettes merging in the glass of the lobby. She didn't cry. The time for tears had ended in the basement with the dead miner. She reached for the notebook in her passenger seat and began to write. She had a plan, Silas wanted to cancel the memorial service to hide his tracks. She was going to make sure the entire town attended. She was going to turn his stage into a gallows. The return to Coalfield felt like a descent into a tomb. By the time Evelyn pulled into the gravel drive of the funeral home, the sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of a miserable dawn. She felt the weight of the bank's freeze before she even walked through the door. She stopped at the local grocery store for milk and bread. Simple things to sustain her through the next 48 hours. The cashier, a woman named Bev, whose husband Evelyn had buried 3 years ago, wouldn't look her in the eye. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," Bev whispered, sliding the debit card back across the counter. "It says, account frozen. Return to issuer." Evelyn stared at the plastic card. It was a small, rectangular piece of uselessness. "There must be a mistake, Bev. Try it again." "I tried 3 times, honey. The bank put a lock on everything. Personal, business, the works." Evelyn walked out with empty hands, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the whispers of the crazy Maddox woman who had spent the funeral home's money on city lofts and silk. When she walked into the kitchen, Silas was there. He was making coffee, the smell of it mocking her empty stomach. He didn't look up as she entered. He just reached into his pocket and tossed a handful of loose change, nickels and dimes, onto the Formica table. The coins rattled, a pathetic, tinny sound in the silence. "For the bus, Evelyn," he said, his voice dripping with a cruel, feigned pity. "Since you can't afford the gas for the car anymore, you're officially penniless. It's a shame, really. If you'd just listened to me, I might have been able to hide some of your indiscretions from the auditors." Evelyn looked at the coins. She looked at the man she had shared a bed with for 20 years. She realized then that he didn't just want her ruined. He wanted her to beg. She turned and walked toward the window. Outside, 2 black SUVs with the Whitmore Funeral Home logo were circling the block. They moved slowly, like sharks in shallow water, their drivers staring up at the Maddox house. They were waiting for the carcass to stop twitching. A shadow moved by the garage. Martha slipped inside, her face pale. "Evelyn," she breathed, catching her breath in the hallway. "I saw the Whitmore trucks. It's worse than we thought." I went back to the office after hours. "The rival firm? They've already signed a preliminary lease for this building. The mayor approved it this morning. They're moving in the day after the foreclosure is finalized." "They won't have a building to move into if I can help it," Evelyn said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of intent. She went to the basement. She needed a sign, a weapon, something Silas hadn't touched. She found herself standing before her father's heavy bronze funeral urn, the one he'd always said was to be his final resting place, though he'd ended up in a simple pine box per his secret instructions. In a fit of grief and frustration, she swept her arm across the shelf. The urn hit the concrete floor with a deafening clang, the lid popping off. As she knelt to gather the spilled ashes, remnants of a life she'd tried to honor, she saw something that shouldn't be there. A small velvet pouch tucked into a false bottom of the urn. Inside was a digital encryption key, a USB drive with her father's initials etched into the casing. She took it to the prep room and locked the door. She plugged it into her laptop, her breath hitching as the screen flickered to life. It wasn't just passwords. It was a master key to every offshore account Silas had opened using the funeral home's routing numbers. Her father had been a cautious man. He had installed a back door into the business software years ago, a failsafe Silas never knew existed. Evelyn watched the screen as the files began to download. tens of thousands of dollars. Transfers to Deborah Whitmore, payments to Galt. It was all there. Every cent stolen, every lie documented in binary. The door handle rattled. "Evelyn? Open this door." Silas's voice was no longer smooth. It was jagged with suspicion. She didn't answer. She watched the progress bar. 82%, 85%. The door groaned as Silas threw his weight against it. "I know what you're doing, Evelyn. I saw the light under the door. Open it now." The wood splintered. Silas burst in, his face contorted with a feral, desperate rage. He saw the laptop. He saw the encryption key. "You bitch!" he roared, lunging across the embalming table. They collided in a chaos of limbs and hatred. Silas grabbed her throat, his thumbs pressing into her windpipe, pinning her against the glass display case filled with restorative cosmetics. "Give it to me," he hissed, his eyes bulging. Evelyn clawed at his face, her nails drawing blood. She reached back, her hand closing around a heavy glass jar of arterial tint. She swung with everything she had left. The jar shattered against the side of Silas's head. He grunted, his grip loosening as they both tumbled to the floor. They crashed through the glass display case, shards of glass and chemical powders raining down on them like lethal snow. Evelyn scrambled back, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She saw the laptop. It had fallen to the floor, but the screen was still lit. Download complete. She grabbed the device and scrambled through the back door of the prep room, throwing the heavy iron bolt just as Silas's fist hit the other side. "You're done, Evelyn," he screamed, his voice muffled by the reinforced steel. "You're a crazy woman hiding in a basement. Who do you think they're going to believe?" As if in answer, a white envelope slid under the door. A legal injunction. Evelyn picked it up with shaking hands. It was a petition filed by Deborah Whitmore, acting as a concerned citizen and business affiliate. It cited Evelyn's recent violent outbursts, her delusional claims of embezzlement, and her deteriorating mental state. It was a request for immediate, involuntary commitment to the state psychiatric asylum. The sirens were closer now. Not the distant hum of city life, but the sharp, insistent wail of the Coalfield police. "They're here for you, Evelyn," Silas called out, his voice returning to that terrifying, calm lilt. "The doctors, the officers. They're going to take you somewhere safe. Somewhere you can't hurt yourself or my business anymore." Evelyn looked at the laptop. She looked at the heavy door. She was trapped in her own basement, surrounded by the tools of the dead, with the law coming to erase her existence. But Evelyn Maddox knew how to handle a body. She knew how to make people see only what she wanted them to see. The police pounded on the front door, their voices echoing through the floorboards. Silas was upstairs now, his voice loud and performative, telling them about his unstable wife locked in the basement. Evelyn moved with the precision of a woman who had performed 1,000 autopsies. She went to the corner of the room where a custom-built, double-bottomed casket sat, a high-end model she'd been preparing for the memorial service. She pulled back the velvet lining, revealing the narrow compartment beneath the false floor. It was meant for smuggling prohibited items across state lines during the old coal wars. A Maddox family secret. She climbed in. It was cold, smelling of cedar and glue. She pulled the false floor over herself, tucking the laptop and the encryption key against her chest. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath to slow, to become as shallow as the dead. She heard the prep room door being breached. She heard Silas's feigned shock when he found the room empty. She's gone. She must have slipped out the back. Then Martha's voice, sharp, authoritative. "Move aside, Silas. The transport truck is here for the ceremonial equipment. We have a schedule to keep, regardless of your domestic drama. Evelyn felt the casket lurch. She was being lifted, the jarring movement of the hand truck vibrating through her spine. She heard the police officers questioning Martha, heard Martha's bored, bureaucratic responses. "It's just an empty box for the stage, officer. If you want to search it, be my guest. But you're holding up a municipal event." The officers, distracted by Silas's frantic searching of the grounds, waved them through. The journey was a nightmare of darkness and near suffocation. Evelyn used a small oxygen tank, the kind used for reviving fainted mourners, to keep herself conscious. Every bump in the road felt like a hammer blow. The heat inside the box became oppressive, the air thick with her own sweat and the metallic scent of the laptop. But she didn't make a sound. She was the cargo. She was the secret. When the truck finally stopped, the silence was even more terrifying. Then, the lid creaked open. Martha's face appeared, illuminated by the street lamps of the town square. "Quickly, they're starting the speeches. Silas is already on the podium." Evelyn climbed out, her legs cramping, her blazer ruined. She looked like a woman who had crawled out of a grave, which, in a way, she had. She slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains of the outdoor stage, her fingers flying over the laptop keys. On the other side of the curtain, Silas was speaking. His voice was amplified by the PA system, echoing across the gathered crowd of hundreds of miners and their families. "It is with a heavy heart," Silas drawled, his voice thick with fake emotion, "that I must tell you my dear wife, Evelyn, cannot be here. The strain of our financial struggles, it has taken a toll on her mind. She is currently under medical care. But the Maddox name will live on through our new partnership with the Whitmore Group." Evelyn stepped out from the shadows. The silence that hit the square was absolute. It was a physical weight, a vacuum that sucked the air out of Silas's lungs. He froze, his mouth open, his hand still raised in a gesture of false humility. "I'm not in the hospital, Silas," Evelyn said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the back of the square without the need for a microphone. "And I'm not insane." She didn't wait for him to recover. She plugged the laptop into the event's projector system, the one Silas had intended to use for a slideshow of Maddox history. The screen behind him flickered to life. It wasn't photos of the past, it was the present. Bank records, offshore transfers, the secret contract signed with the Whitmores, detailing the sale of the town's communal land for a strip mining project. The luxury jewelry receipts, the forged signatures. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a low, dangerous growl of a town that had been pushed too far. The miners, men with soot in their lungs and fire in their hearts, surged toward the stage. Silas tried to run, his face pale and sweating, but the exit was blocked by a wall of denim and anger. Deborah Whitmore, standing in the wings, tried to slip away. But Martha was there, the local sheriff, finally seeing the truth, standing beside her. The jewelry was a bribe for the councilman. Evelyn shouted over the din, pointing to the receipts on the screen. "They sold you out for diamonds while your families faced foreclosure." The police, who had followed the commotion from the funeral home, didn't move to arrest Evelyn. They moved toward Silas. The evidence was too loud, too bright, too undeniable. Evelyn stood on the stage, the light of the projector casting the numbers of Silas's crimes across her face like war paint. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the judge. The sun began to rise over the Appalachian peaks as the last of the police cars pulled away. Silas and Deborah locked in the back. The town square was quiet now, the air smelling of damp grass and the first hints of wood smoke. Evelyn walked back to the funeral home. It was hers again. The foreclosure had been halted by an emergency injunction based on the evidence of fraud. She stood on the sagging front porch, watching the gold and pink light of the dawn hit the brickwork. The building was old, scarred, and smelling of death. But as she looked at the crowd of miners still gathered at the gate, not as mourners, but as neighbors, she knew what had to happen. The Maddox family funeral home wouldn't just be a place for the dead anymore. It would be a community center, a place for the living to gather, to organize, to breathe. She felt the weight of her father's brooch on her lapel. She felt the steady rhythm of her own heart. For the first time in 47 years, Evelyn Maddox wasn't arranging a life for someone else. She was finally living her own. The sunrise was blinding. It was beautiful. It was enough.